All
I love
right.
the opening music. It makes me feel like we're about to heist a casino.
Yeah, that's about right. That's the vibe we're going for here. Well, instead of doing that, we are going to watch. I think probably the first half, given the time constraints, because Dr. Kuba is on This is Revolution tonight. But we're going to watch about the first half of a recent debate that happened between two people who are both repeat former guests on the show, although they obviously really disagree about this topic. One of them is New York Mag intelligencer's Eric Levitz, and the other one is Jacobin staff writer Branko Marcetic. So that's so this is a this is an important showdown between the New York Jewish guy perspective and the Serbian guy from New Zealand perspective on Eastern Europe.
They're significantly more invested and interested in it than 7th century Boston, like 7th generation Boston Irish or something. But yeah, it's one of the interesting things about the Ukraine war, that marks it out from this interminable series of regional confrontations we've had since the fall of the Cold War, end of the Cold War, is the fact that there's been so much outside interest staked in what's really a regional conflict. When the government of Kazakhstan was briefly toppled and then reinstated, just prior to this conflict, you had nowhere near the level of outside investment and involvement over what's arguably a strategically equally significant regional player.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I wonder if part of that is just the sort of, relative novelty of there being a big dramatic, land war invasion that has two things that make it, a little bit different from others that have happened, in the recent past. So, one, unlike, the wars in like the Middle East, in the 2000s, 2010s, it's in Europe, right? So we care more about that. And then two, it's, it's not the United States doing it, right? So we can kind of see it from an outsider perspective. Like, I mean, I've the sort of, grim little half joking comment I've made many times about this is that it's been kind of remarkable to watch the American media discover that dropping cluster bombs on cities is like a war crime that like has this, like kills lots of civilians and, and all of that this would have been interesting knowledge to bring to bear on U.S. Media coverage of other recent wars.
I mean, you should just bookend any incident of American news media waxing poetic about the humanitarian cost of war with that the time that you had the quote from Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons," being made by an anchor in order to sort of properly give context to the beginning of yet another bombing campaign.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I should say, just to set this up a little bit, sometimes we'll watch things here where I'll kind of be learning with the audience, what the positions of the people are in detail in some of the issues. But in this case, I have followed pretty closely what both of these guys have said about it. That Bronco is honestly one of the relatively few people, even in left media, print media, who has been consistently voicing a lot of concerns about the possible bad effects of flooding, Ukraine with arms, and like pointed out, for example, that even before all this, it was a major black market for weapons. And there are all sorts of, scenarios where you might worry about blowback, from like right-wing extremists, getting their hands on these weapons, etc. So he's one of relatively few people who's been saying things like that, and he has, and he's certainly been one of relatively few people who have been pushing the idea that it's like really bad that the United States has not been, pushing for a negotiated settlement and, participating in negotiations and all that. Whereas I think, Eric Levitz is somebody whose overall posture politically for somebody in his mainstream media perch as he's in is one that, is like relatively Jacobin-y. Right, I mean, like he's very friendly to sort of Bernie-ish, social democratic policy ideas, and I've had conversations with him where he said that he would be long term dream bigger dreams than that, and he certainly doesn't, I think, want to do like the sort of truly like demented and evil things that some people would like to do, like start a no-fly zone that would, end all life on Earth. But I think on this, I think he's probably a little bit closer to sort of mainstream liberal views. I mean, I think that's fair.
Well, he says so himself. It's not a mischaracterization if his one of his starting points is that on the left we need to be more sensitive of mainstream opinion. And therefore, I've engaged with some of these mainstream counter arguments with the standard leftist position. That's how he frames this debate that we're going to watch, his position. So I think it's definitely the case that he has more attachment to the conventional political system, to more mainstream publications, more centrist positions, more centrist political actors or commentators. But there's nothing wrong with that.
Sure.
Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're right. Right. But for me, watching this debate, and I watched it twice ahead of the show, I have some kind of big picture sort of structural observations. I don't know if I should do them now so we can see them play out, or should I wait until the end?
Maybe at a very sort of general kind of level of analysis, could give us your general sense of it.
So the conversation, much of the debate comes down to a difference in specialization and lens of analysis. So Eric Levitz comes at this with much more of an American politics, communications perspective. And the framework he uses to understand Ukraine is kind of generic IR 101. I mean, no offense. It's not that it's crude. It's just that he doesn't have a lot of insider knowledge about things like the structure of military aid, transatlantic security relationships, or the Ukrainian state. And I think that he'd be very forthcoming about those limitations to his specific area knowledge. With Branko, I think you actually have a very, very deep regional expertise. Russia, Ukraine, Balkans, probably going all the way back to like the big historical changes following the fall of communism. And so you have Eric setting up sort of hypothetical problems, theoretical problems, like what if this is the case? Mm-hmm. And Branko's being like, no, we actually know what those empirical variables look like, and therefore the criticism that you're proposing is much less likely than this scenario that I can describe, because I know how things like military aid will actually filter through down to the level of distributing arms.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, let's give it a start. See if we can watch a decent chunk of it. I'm very tempted, since I've got you on, to ask you a bunch of questions about what's going on right now, because I know you keep up on that and a lot of granular detail. But I'm gonna resist that impulse, so we can actually start watching the debate and watch a decent chunk of it tonight. I should say that Achilles Albergine in the chat says, "What mic is Dr. Kuba using? Because his voice sounds like chocolate." So apparently,
is that good?
I think so.
We're not talking about Hershey's chocolate. We're talking about like Godiva, the stuff that like regular drugstores put under lock and key. That's the chocolate, right?
I would assume so. Yeah.
I would say.
All right. Let's watch some of this. Got Kale, who I think we can agree he's the producer at Jacobin. He used to be the producer on this show, and I think we can agree that he needs
an office. Like I'm counting Post-it pads behind him.
Yeah. Yep. No, I know where that room is. So yeah, I think Kale. I see. It's like one of those things, like people who want to play guitar, and so they're gonna find out what specific kind of pick, like guitar pick that Jimi Hendrix used. I think that Kale probably was so inspired by the Bernie Sanders campaign that he decided he'd throw away his own comb to try to more closely approximate Senator Sanders. But in any case, let's watch.
As the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine has now gone into its second month, the American left has produced a number of responses to the situation. Much has been made of both the Russian ruling class's aggression and the American ruling class's geopolitical interests in Eastern Europe, as well as what is the most appropriate means to achieve peace in the war and the region broadly. But this has provoked a number of criticisms and responses. Most of them have been pretty dismissive, but easily the most thoughtful has come from New York Magazine's Eric Levitz in a piece titled "The Left Has Half-Baked Answers on Ukraine." So to go into this, we are now joined by Eric Levitz, as well as Jacobin's own Bronco Kotich. Bronco recently wrote a response article titled "What the Left's Critics Ignore About the Military Solutions to Ukraine." So I'm now going to hand it over to Eric, who's going to outline where the article came from, what the main arguments are, and then we'll hear from Bronco, and it'll open into a little bit more of a larger discussion. So, Eric.
Sounds good. The impetus for the piece, there's been really sort of a diversity of thought about the Russia-Ukraine conflict within the broad American left. But, within a significant portion of the socialist left, and I think the mainstream of DSA, the basic position has been to oppose sending military aid to Ukraine of any kind, and as well as opposing broad-based sanctions on Russia. I'm sympathetic to aspects of this position. I think I broadly, tentatively agree with the position on sanctions, and I tentatively support the arming of Ukraine, and so object there, although my views are a bit unsettled on that. What I was most concerned with in the responses to it was less the positions themselves than what I felt like was the quality of a lot of the argumentation, which I felt like failed to acknowledge or anticipate sort of counter arguments and objections that I think are very prominent within the discourse and come, I think, pretty readily to mind if one really sort of scrutinizes the question. And I thought that was important, sort of an important failing, in part because the positions that the socialist left is arguing against here are really overwhelmingly popular among Americans. There's broad public support in polls for arming Ukraine and sanctioning Russia. And these positions also have significant traction among the broad liberal left and a lot of people who are potentially, very sympathetic to socialist politics. I know multiple DSA members or people who were DSA members who have left the organization out of alienation from these positions. And so given that climate, I think it's, just for the, to the extent that socialists are going to succeed in persuading the unconverted about this stance on the conflict, and to the extent that they're going to more broadly just sort of build their base, I think it's really important to reason about these questions, really carefully and seriously, and steel man and anticipate sort of what the skeptics' objections are going to be. So what I saw as kind of a key weakness in the arguments was sort of this presentation of seeking a diplomatic resolution to the conflict and providing military aid to Ukraine as sort of self-evidently antithetical positions, and not addressing the objection that,
Pause
potentially.
just for a second. He's just going to roll into the question of military aid, but I wanted to bring up a couple things about what he said so far.
Yeah.
I think he's very honest in his framing. He's saying that, look, this is a position in which the left has issued basically the same cookie cutter anti-interventionist response that you would get from pressure to do something about Syria or to do something about Iran or any other conflict where a quote unquote resistance country might be involved, right? Hands off Venezuela, no more sanctions, right? And I think that reflectively, that is what happened when leftists who didn't have a great deal of interest or background in the geopolitics of Eastern Europe hear that there's a movement for U.S. intervention in another foreign conflict. You reach for the template, the framework that is sort of tried and true, that you can apply across cases. And what Eric is doing very admirably, I'd say, capably, and I'm impressed with his diligence, is taking that cookie cutter template and trying to fill in enough context around it to make a considered evaluation, both in terms of, well, does this framework apply to the Ukrainian case, but also in messaging to the American people, right? And Eric makes it sound like there's a lot of persuadables out there, that which I'd argue that may not be the case. That is a debatable point, to what extent persuasion is actually necessary. But he's upfront with the fact that this is partly about maintaining an attractive and inviting image to the socialist coalition, to centrist elements that might be alienated with too strong a line, an anti-war line, which could be read as pro-Putin or morally outrageous in other kinds of ways.
Yeah, right. And look, I mean, I obviously do share his, concern, abstracted a little bit from the specific case, about, the left worried about, kind of taking persuasion more seriously than it does, and worried about how it presents its case and all that stuff. I mean, hence the name of the show. But I do, I guess to me, I would just say, okay, but we do want to separate out two questions a little bit here, right? One is what do we actually think? And then once we figured out what we actually think,
what should we say?
Right. Then
what should we say we think, right?
Yeah, I mean, I get right. So, I mean,
yeah.
If you're gonna, if you're just gonna misrepresent it, then at least know what you're misrepresenting. But then even if you're, especially if you're not planning to misrepresent it, right? Then I can see that there's a separate issue about okay.
Yes. How do you communicate your
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think it's completely reasonable to say I have tactical questions about where you put your emphasis and all that stuff. But again, I do think it's important to start from what do you actually
exactly
think? And,
exactly.
And I would just say on that template issue, I mean, I think you're probably right. I mean, right, that the I do think that most leftists, like most Americans in general, right, are not coming from a place of, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, I think that, like, 0.0001% of Americans who have strong opinions about the conflict in Ukraine, like, knew who, like, Zelensky was, for example, before February.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you're getting to this. The positions that Eric describes as being majoritarian are enjoying mainstream popularity. It may be true, but like you replace Russia and Ukraine with Kyrgyzstan and Agrabad, you're going to get the same numbers because they just reflect people's moral instincts when you say that a bigger country is invading a smaller country.
I think that's right. So I mean, the question is, like, all right, if everybody has kind of applied their templates, that the best of us maybe watch This Is Revolution, and we we learn from you some actual specific things about it, but like most of us are just applying templates. Like, I will say there is a question that's worth pausing to ask here, which is like, okay, like what's is there anything we could actually say about which of these templates is like generally a good one? Because you are going to have to do a certain amount of reasoning for
intellectual triage, right?
Yeah.
They can't know everything.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I would feel pretty comfortable making the argument that if you look at the history of, well, I mean, just in general, but especially the last 20 years or so, I think the sort of left template of be very nervous and suspicious, when you start hearing arguments for intervention, is probably a much better template.
Oh yeah, then guided by the beauty of our weapons / we need to do something / at least we did something, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is the classic liberal template. We just killed a bunch of people and the war didn't end, but at least we did all we could. So that's the important thing. I think it was Mark Twain who described some character as treating the entire world as her own moral gymnasium. And that's a little like the lib instinct, isn't it? Right? There's a problem. Can we solve it? Especially if it lets us bomb and feel good about it.
Yeah, no, exactly. That that like it feels like decisive action, and so you could say, well, here was a bad thing that happened in the world. We at least tried to do something about it, and yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the track record of that is pretty horrendous. So I'm pretty okay with like I think it's a healthy starting instinct. I think that you can have I think there might be cases where, to a certain extent, you could budge me from it a little bit. That I think that your This Is Revolution colleague Gene Bajalan and the late Michael Brooks, did that for me a little bit with Rojava. Like I think that there are. I'm not against saying here are context-specific reasons to think that things are not as they appear, but I actually think it's incredibly healthy and desirable if the left has like starts out from the anti-interventionist really, 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 really strong template, which I mean I consider that. I mean, I consider that like to the credit of, Jackman, to the credit, without defending every detail of like everything anybody has said in a statement or whatever, but like generally to the credit of like DSA, for example, especially when there's tremendous pressure to go the other way, right? That like we're in an environment where, I haven't seen more recent polls on this, but at least in late February, like something like 3/4 of Americans said, yeah, let's put up a no-fly zone and start World War III. So
exactly. Like, and to hell with the consequences, right? It's the right thing to do because Fox TV lady told me it was.
Yeah, no, exactly. All right. I guess the one thing maybe I would say before we go back to Eric is just that I do. Granted, this debate was like a few weeks ago and things move quickly, but I will say I do get a little frustrated with the sort of way that people who want to criticize the sort of position that Bronco, for example, is taking here tend to focus so narrowly on the question of weapons and military aid. And I know that's the first issue I brought up earlier, but like, I mean, to my mind, that's like, okay, I actually think that's a little bit of a complicated issue. I think there are like real arguments you can make on both sides of that, but I also, I would certainly be much more comfortable with like weapons shipments with one hand if there was like a real push for for a negotiated settlement that was accompanying it, but also at this point so many weapons have already been sent, and there's so much that's been done besides sending weapons that I find it a little frustrating to sort of act as if that were the whole issue, that like people who on the left who have concerns about escalating the conflict, or at the very least prolonging it, that's it, right? I mean, like the New York Times, for example, last night reported that American intelligence was helping Ukraine assassinate Russian generals, which is the kind of thing that is like, that's a big escalation
I mean, consider the sinking of the Moskva, the cruise missile, the guided missile cruiser that was the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. That attack couldn't have been executed without some level of guidance and operational assistance and intelligence from NATO countries. And it's the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. That is a significant escalation in terms of the area, the theater of combat, as well as the types of targets and losses being inflicted, and by whom. It's not a Ukrainian front on a NATO operation, but it is a type of Ukrainian operation that would be impossible without, like you said, participation by NATO that goes beyond supplying weapons.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it just seems like there are like, I would like to have a sort of general debate about the extent to which, like, do you think the United States should be more deeply involved, should like become ever more deeply involved in this conflict, which I think is the real sort of nub of the issue. That like doesn't just present it as if those sorts of initial weapons shipments, pro or con, were the only possible issue.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Similarly, fixating around the no-fly zone is also narrows the debate considerably, and it makes it seem as though NATO basically doing what it was going to already could be construed as some kind of victory for the left.
Yeah, no, that's true, right? I mean, so that's like the sort of, I mean, on this scale of things that the United States could do, American involvement in the conflict, like sending some weapons is sort of at the bottom end of the scale, and starting World War III is at the top end, and and there's a big middle there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go back to Eric. Make sure we at least get through this before you have to go.
A militarily strong Ukraine might be a precondition in order for a diplomatic resolution to be possible. So in the piece of Branko's that sort of kicked off our back and forth, he wrote that in opposition to sending arms to Ukraine, and argued that peace could only be achieved by a mutually acceptable negotiated settlement that guarantees Ukraine's territorial integrity while addressing Russia's longstanding security concerns. So my primary critique of that piece was that it framed military aid to Ukraine as an alternative to such a settlement, without addressing the counter argument that military aid might be necessary in order to achieve one. And I think that there's some evidence to support that position, even if it's not necessarily dispositive. So we know that at the invasion's outset, Russia declared its interest in conquering, fully demilitarizing Ukraine, dissolving its army, and regime change in Kiev. They had sort of very maximalist military goals that would have completely eroded Ukraine's sovereignty over its territory. And it was the Ukrainian army's unanticipated success, its strength in fending off this much larger Russian force and imposing far more casualties and losses of equipment than the Russian leadership had anticipated, that has led the Kremlin to at least signal right now that it might be amenable to a settling basically for the annexation of the Donbass and a land bridge from Crimea through to Russia, along with Ukrainian commitment to neutrality and several other provisions. It's not 100% clear, whether that would in fact satisfy the Kremlin, and there's a bunch of obstacles to sealing that as an agreement. Nonetheless, we are moving towards a situation where the kind of agreement that both Branko and I support seems a bit more possible, and it seems to be downstream of Ukrainian military strength. So there is this question of what role Western military aid actually played in Ukraine's battlefield performance thus far, and I am, I don't have the authority to speak definitively on that. It seems to me from the reporting that I've seen that Javelin and Stinger missiles, various forms of air defense, have proven important in Ukraine's military success. I do think that even if one discounts the importance of specific military aid and weapons provisions since the invasion, if you consider that the Ukrainian defense forces have been built up for several years through Western military aid in the form of training operations and various forms of assistance since the 2014 invasion, I think it's hard to sustain that Western military aid has played no role in Ukraine's capacity to fend off this invasion. I think that those on Branko's side of the debate would argue that military aid itself, is a cause of the war, that it was a provocation to Russia. And I think that's a serious argument. But I also think that, we kind of, none of us has access to the inner workings of Vladimir Putin's mind. And so I think we fundamentally cannot dismiss the possibility that, like other megalomaniacal leaders throughout history, including George W. Bush, Putin may have launched a regime change war in Ukraine out of offensive imperial ambitions rather than defensive security concerns. In which case it's possible that, had the West withheld military assistance since 2014, that Russia would control a great deal more of Ukraine, and perhaps even have managed to take over Kiev, which could have precipitated sort of the same protracted counterinsurgency war that we saw when our government took over Baghdad. And so, for these reasons, it just seems to me that it's not obvious that withholding military aid in Ukraine would either have been conducive to a settlement of the conflict that would have preserved Ukrainian territorial integrity, even over part of its territory. Nor is it clear to me that it would have advanced the goal of just peace, even if we stipulate that we're not that interested in Ukrainian nationalism. It seems to me that everything that we've seen so far indicates that Russia is not capable of commanding the legitimacy necessary to occupy Ukraine and establish peace and stability, that this would lead to counterinsurgency war. So there are other arguments that I made, but I think that this is the central point of contention between Branko and I, so I think I might leave off there.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. I want to say I have a great deal of respect for Eric, and I love reading his stuff. I disagree pretty heavily with the argument he was making. I mean, my piece that basically that was responding to this, the first thing we have to understand is that there's limits to what we can do. And I say we, you can say the United States, the West, whatever. There's really profound limits. Just as with the Iraq War, when Bush invaded Iraq, there were limits to what could be done. And no one suggested, let's pour money into Iraq's security forces, let's give them weapons, let's try and train them, let's give them intelligence support to try and fight. No one suggested that because there was a real danger of the war, which is terrible and appalling, but it was not necessarily worth it to escalate the situation beyond what it was and potentially turn it into a wider confrontation, turn it into something that could end up being a nuclear war. It's a similar case here. My hesitance to support military aid, when I say military aid, I mean the lethal aid, the offensive aid, the tens of thousands of rifles, grenade launchers, grenades, missiles that are being just sent into the country, and basically, from the sounds of it, being kind of distributed pretty indiscriminately, is that for the
Kuba, were you indicating you want to interject there?
Yes, I was, but I hadn't taken myself off of mute, which, rookie mistake. But in any case, right here, I think we see the divergence between Bronco, who has more case-specific empirical knowledge, than Eric, who's talking at a more abstract and general level. And one of the tendencies of applying an abstract model is converting portions of the state or the conflict or the case you're examining into boxes which you treat as unitary elements. The bigger the boxes, the coarser the view. And Eric seems to have one big box for the Ukrainian state. You give the Ukrainian state weapons. You give the Ukrainian state training and aid. And the Ukrainian state does things in the interests of this huge aggregate, which is an entire country. While Branko takes it and says, well, it's not the American state giving weapons to the Ukrainian state. There's going to be containers. There's going to be shipments. There's going to be trucks or even carloads arriving in different towns and cities all across Ukraine. They're going to be unpacked by guys in uniform, and they're going to be handed out to people. Who are those people? Who are those guys in uniform? These are questions that you have to go far, far more granular than the idea of a Ukrainian state receiving, defensive supplies or defensive aid. And when you go down to that level, you have to begin worrying about, well, which units of the Ukrainian military? Are these units associated with far-right militia, or are they more sort of in the vein of the civic militaries that Americans or Westerners, post-World War II Westerners, might take for granted? Are these another simple fact is that periods of conflict provide excellent environments for organized crime, for gangs to put on uniforms, call themselves irregulars or paramilitaries, and then for either side, for both sides, conduct execution, theft, torture, kidnapping, you name it.
Right.
Are those weapons going to these guys? Because these guys are great when they are eating at your enemies. They're terrible when they freelance,
Right.
come after you. But who's making the decision about where the weapons go? One reason why there's a bias on the part of the United States or NATO allies to at least the high-end decision makers to go for big ticket, splashy weapon systems, like the MiG fighter swap with Poland and Bulgaria, or the anti-defense S-400s or other missile systems, is that the bigger the unit, the bigger the specific weapon system, the easier it is to track. You'll know if it ends up on the black market. You'll know if it ends up in the wrong hands, because there's only 2 or 3 sets of hands that are the right ones. But although those are the weapons that get attention, Branko is absolutely right when he talks about all of the lethal lower end guns. Like, and for Americans too, that are used to their country being flooded with weapons, it may also come as a shock, right? Like that this may be a disruptive move, right? Giving every citizen access to an assault rifle may not be a normal condition for other societies, and they may not know how to handle it. And very reasonable people there might feel threatened or destabilized by that kind of access to that kind of lethal power for that indiscriminate a public.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. All right, let's. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that. Let's go back to this.
Unclear benefit, and I'll explain why I think it's unclear. The unclear benefit of actually what that will bring, I think it does not weigh up to the potential risks, which are really serious, and which, unfortunately, in US discourse around this war have not really been talked about at all. They've sort of been swept under the rug because they're very inconvenient to the kind of rah-rah jingoistic message that has been pushed for the US and other Western countries to intervene more forcefully in Ukraine. And just to be clear, I'm not saying Eric is doing a jingoistic argument, but that's kind of the climate right now. Number one, I'm sure the military aid has had some effect. I think it's also worth noting that apparently even US intelligence believed that Kiev was going to fall in 2 days, and it didn't. And there's big questions about why that didn't happen. Military aid is one answer, and of course that's one that's going to be preferred by people who are in favor of that policy, or even further US military expansion or intervention in this conflict. But also there's the fact that, and this is not me saying it, this is a piece by William Arkin, veteran journalist in Newsweek, who talked to analysts working for the Pentagon and retired Air Force officers. They point out that, for instance, the Russian Air Force has not really been used throughout the war. It has a little bit, but not to the extent that you would imagine. Why is that? There's several different possible strategic reasons why they decide to do it, but it is just as likely that Putin miscalculated in some way, and that the Ukraine's surprising resistance is less to do with some of these things that the US has been doing, as helpful as they might have been, and more to do with a whole bunch of other factors, including some of those things that the US alleges, that Russian troops are low on morale, that they're confused and don't really know why they're there, they don't really want to be there, that they're working with faulty equipment, so on and so forth. Okay. But, like I said, I don't know. And we don't know, no one knows. I think it's going to be a long time before we actually know what exactly happened. But what are the risks? It's not as simple as just you send all these weapons into the country. Ukraine is able to be stronger against Russia. They fight them down to some sort of stalemate, and then a peace is reached, and that's it. Because those weapons don't disappear the moment a peace deal is reached, or some sort of ceasefire agreement is reached. Those weapons are still around. And there's the worrying issue of the fact that, of course, it can go on the black market and go God knows where, through Europe, potentially into Eastern Europe, who knows, maybe even into the Middle East. What that would cause, at this point, we can't say, but that's a very worrying thing. But there are also really Ukraine-specific concerns about what it means to just flood the country with weapons. And the Ukrainian far right is the most worrying thing. At the moment, there's this, because Putin used this pretext of denazification to justify the invasion, because that's such a big part of Russian propaganda, in the West now, there is this wholesale kind of attempt to either just never talk about this issue, or actually to I've now started seeing reporting that's kind of playing down, the importance or the power, the influence, or even the radicalism of the Ukrainian far right. But Ukraine has had a serious far right problem for a very long time. There's not just the Azov regiment, which is part of the National Guard, but there's all sorts of right-wing militias. Militias that are white supremacists. They're anti-democratic. They view their path to power as going through violent means. And you have to remember that they did manage in part to do this once. The 2014 revolution, the Maidan revolution, it was overwhelmingly pro-Western liberal Ukrainians who were driving that protest movement. And they were concerned about issues like corruption and authoritarianism. But that protest was also in many ways hijacked. And if you go back and look at Western reporting from even US government funded outlets before 2021, 2020, they all say this openly, which is that the far right did have a really important role in those protests. And the kind of crucial moment where that Yanukovych, the president, decided to flee was basically when they had come up with a political settlement with the opposition. The opposition went back to the Maidan protesters, and the protesters were not happy about this. And an ultra-nationalist, one of the ultra-nationalist leaders, he came up on stage and he said, basically, if Yanukovych is not out of here by tomorrow morning, we are going to storm the presidential palace, we're going to storm parliament, and we're going to take him out. And he got the hell out of there. So they succeeded at doing this once. In the successive years after that,
so
the Ukrainian far right has, people always point.
I pause it there because we're going, Branko is unpacking or disassembling another couple of boxes for us here. One is Ukrainian domestic politics, Ukrainian social movements. And one of the common rejoinders that's made about the Ukrainian far right is, well, they've never done well at elections. Look at all of these non-far right units in the Ukrainian military compared to the number that are actual, sort of out and proud Nazis. Clearly the balance is on the side of the good guys. Why are you making such a big deal out of the far right? And the Branko is pointing out that the Ukrainian politics is a contested, it itself is a field of contest as much as the country militarily or strategically between Russia and the government of Ukraine. The liberal Democrats like, Zelensky, establishment Democrats, people that mainstream Americans would be comfortable with, they aren't the agenda unilateralists setting up all the institutions, commanding all of the nodes of power inside Ukraine politically. They're in a very serious struggle, one which could potentially turn into a violent struggle with the far right over hegemony within the Ukrainian state. And elections, one of the reasons why we draw a distinction between Russia and the Ukraine is because we know that in some countries, things are engineered so much and there's so much coercion behind the scenes or within institutions that election results don't really tell you that much. So similarly, the Ukrainian far right can get to political domination in Ukraine without ever winning an electoral majority. And one way that you do that is by colonizing the security apparatus, which is what they've been doing quite successfully since 2014. And incidentally, what training and weapons shipments can empower them to do even more aggressively if they outcompete the sort of anti-fascist or non-fascist elements within the Ukrainian military and state institutions. I can't hear you.
You cannot hear me because I was muted. All right. Thought it'd make you feel better. All right. So, yeah, no. I mean, and I think what Branko's pointing to here, there is something really frustrated about the way that, before this year, it was there'd be like Western mainstream media reports that would be like, oh man, there's like far right groups in Ukraine. They're, actually pretty worried. And that was a totally normal thing to see appear in these outlets. And now, it's the sort of party line is like, you're a Putin apologist if you if you think that there's any there. And
every fighter a hero is the line now, right? Slava Ukraina, Slava Geroi. But the truth is that like maybe every fighter not a hero. Maybe some of them are still Nazis. Like they were 6 months ago.
And like this the way that there is this like overreaction to the sort of absurd claims that actual Putin apologists will make about this, that like anybody who actually does take the denazification stuff seriously, but like the way that there's this like absurd overreaction to that where it's like you're just not allowed to acknowledge that there's like anything worth noticing or being worried about here at all, which is, I've got to say, pretty jarring, especially when it comes from like, American liberals who, since my memory extends as far back as say 2018, have been very worried about, neo-Nazis in the United States. And, like the, like Charlottesville, was a big, was like something that was a large thing on their radar. They all knew who Richard Spencer was.
The alt-right, Pepe the Frog, Kekistan.
Yeah, exactly. And then you say, well, hey, there's this country where there's this, there are far-right, militias that are actually integrated into the armed forces, people who are just, out and proud Nazis.
Yeah. Like where the 101st Airborne is still like paratrooper heroes, but the 99th Airborne is like Kentucky Klansmen official unit.
Yeah. They have the the Klan flag and all that stuff.
Exactly. No, the hood is ceremonial. It goes with the uniform, right? Like, don't impress me, bro.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it just seems like this sort of like, well, there are only really like 10,000 people in the Nazi battalion of the of this army. It's like I don't know. I think you would think that was a lot if that were if we're talking about the United States here. That there were 10,000 members.
It's a very healthy society, right? Like with strong institutions, they elect minorities as president. So I think triple digit Nazis in uniform should be totally manageable for them, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and I mean, especially because the best sort of defense of all of this, like, or at least sort of the best defense of, Zelensky and co, kind of like putting up with it is, well, especially when the war first started in 2014, it was very chaotic. You sort of needed all the help you could get, and this is, and basically that like things are bad enough that you sort of have no choice.
Exactly.
And
deal with the devil.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, fine, fair enough, right? But like, if so, like that does kind of underline Branko's point about how, like, if you really are in a situation that's dire enough that like the regular elected government, overseeing the regular civil military is actually does have no choice except to work with these people, then that fact itself would make me more worried
about the arms shipments. Yeah. Well, and this is, I think that Branko is actually soft pedaling it, if anything. That, and it's not lost on me that the wave of not just state on state confrontation, but civil war and criminal violence that came in the 1990s had a lot to do with the fact that all of these Soviet weapon stockpiles, which had previously been under lock and key, which had previously been secured, could now wash out into the black market and instantly turn any gang with enough money into a light infantry unit. forget light, you know, why don't we go to mechanized, right? Like and the only reason why I might not be as alarmed as Branko is that I don't think that more weapons on the international black market at this point would be meaningful except in driving the price down.
Got it.
Because between Syria, between Iraq, between all of the military aid going through the American aid to the Middle East, the war in Yemen, conflicts in Ethiopia, and Ukraine's own murky history, which Branko points out as an arms producing and trafficking nation, I think that every market is saturated. Unfortunately, that may mean that more weapons fall into the hands of far-right groups without budgets that are that large, and that are then able to parlay them into an advantage in places that are less used to violence. Like, I'd be really worried if I were in Western Europe about where those arms shipments to Ukraine ultimately end up. If they insist on a hard border in Ireland and the IRA needs to resupply, well, this may be something that Whitehall needs to think about, right? Like those weapons may go back in.
No, that's and also, I mean, even more directly, I mean, like there are, my understanding is that there are, far right volunteers from Western Europe who are actually in the mix, on the ground, right? Like at the moment, right? I mean, like those people presumably aren't going to, become peaceful, well-adjusted members of their original societies afterwards.
Frankly, I'm more worried about the misguided liberals, because when you fight with fascists, it's very difficult to resist their appeals for fraternity. Like, after all, they just saved your life. After all, how bad can they be? And that's going to be a vector for normalization of far-right personalities and far-right politics.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's see if we can finish out Bronco's opening, and then we'll probably have to call it a day for today.
To the electoral, the modest electoral success of the far right, to say, so there isn't a problem in Ukraine. That's not really how it's measured, or how you should measure the influence of the far right in Ukraine. They are a very militant and well-organized activist movement. They regularly resort to street violence to get their way, and they've been pretty successful at shifting the political center in Ukraine into a more ultra-nationalist direction, with the government passing things that kind of glorify Nazi collaborators and discriminating against Russian speakers in Ukraine. For instance, when Petro Poroshenko in 2015 tried to implement part of the Minsk Accords, which were agreed to as a solution to the fighting in the east, in the Donbass, what happened was there was a massive protest outside Parliament. The far right staged this confrontation. There were grenades being done. I believe 3 police officers or 3 security members were killed in that scuffle. And basically, from there until this very war, the far right has consistently said, basically, whether it's Poroshenko or Zelensky, who, by the way, ran and won an insane mandate on a peace platform, they have said if anyone tries to implement some sort of peace, which they regard as a capitulation to Russia, we will, they'll pay for it with their life. We will attack them. And that wasn't the last time Poroshenko was attacked. Zelensky himself has been threatened by these far-right figures. I think a few days before the war was launched, even the New York Times said, Zelensky's in a bit of a difficult position here because the far right that are the most effective fighting force against the Russians they're also a double-edged sword, because what they could end up doing as well is overthrowing his government if they decide that the peace he settles on isn't accepted. So this is what the New York Times was saying, just a few days before the conflict. Now, my question is, what happens when there are weapons just spreading through the country, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of weapons? Some of those are going to disappear to the black market. They're going to make their way into basically any Ukrainians willing to fight, into their hands. What does that mean for these far-right militias? What does it mean for the future democratic prospects of Ukraine if suddenly there is a better armed and actually battle-hardened ultra-nationalist bloc that's willing to use violence, that's willing to overthrow the government by force if need be, and that views any sort of peace with Russia as a capitulation? What does that mean for what could happen in the coming months, years? What does it mean for the vulnerable groups who are targets of violence and harassment by these far-right militias? The LGBTQ community, the Roma community. We don't know. We don't know what that's going to lead to. And the thing I always think about is it's that infamous Zbigniew Brzezinski quote from is it the late 80s or the no, it would have been sometime in the 90s, when he justified the US equipping and funding and training the Mujahideen in the 80s in Afghanistan against the Soviets. And the quote was, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but it was, what's more important, the liberation of Europe and the end of the Cold War, or a few stirred up Muslims somewhere in the Middle East? And of course, those words became very, very tragically ironic in less than a decade later, when of course those stood up Muslims ended up carrying out the worst attack on US soil in the form of September 11. And we have to remember that the far right in Ukraine was, long before this war, kind of an epicenter for far right organizing all over the world, including from the US. There were American extremists who were inspired by Azov, who went over to Ukraine to make contacts, to get training, that kind of thing. I think we're not nearly close to the end of what this war is, and we don't know how it's going to go. But I think we have to remember the failure of all of us to be able to see, years and decades into the future, and what it might mean, to side, even if it's indirectly, to tacitly side and support violent extremists now out of terror convenience, that can become a very untemporary inconvenience later on. And I'll just say, in terms of what whether the military aid has helped to kind of strengthen Ukraine's hand. I mean, Russia's military aims certainly have changed. They seem to be stepping back from the regime change goal. I don't know if that's going to stick. We'll see. I hope it does. But I think it's also worth noting that in terms of the actual negotiating demands, Ukraine has successfully given more. Ukraine at first was unwilling to budge on the NATO issue. Zelensky a week or two ago said, you know what, NATO's not going to happen, and we're happy to talk about neutralization. Zelensky also was pretty firm on not acknowledging any of Russia's territorial demands. The other day, he said that he was willing to compromise in the Donbass, and he sort of walked it back. But it does seem like, military aims have changed, but the negotiating demands, Ukraine seems to be giving more and more, at least as it stands now, as this war goes on. So I think that's also worth going into. But yeah, I think the risk to both American life and the risk to Ukrainians, the stability of Ukraine, the stability of the entire region, I think could be really upended by just sort of continuing to pour military aid in there. I think we have to grapple with this fact if we are going to make a case for sending these weapons into the country.
All right. So as far as the part of the debate that we're watching, we should probably end there for today. So you could do "This Is Revolution." Do you have any thoughts about the last part of that discussion?
I think that he was getting. I think that he was really. Branko was reaching the crux of his argument about how unexpected consequences can come from these policies, precisely because it isn't the Ukrainian state, a unitary, reliable, bureaucratically rigorous actor you're dealing with, but a porous and contested institution with lots of actors with their own interests. And yeah, I need to go and do This Is Revolution. If anybody's interested, then in continuing their evening of leftist foreign policy, invite you all over, and I look forward to getting back to this next week.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, if you are,
I have a couple of videos from Sublation that talking with Doug Lane and with Stefan on different aspects of the Ukraine conflict. I'll send the links. Sublation.
Yep,
We're going to be launching in June. Very excited about that.
Yeah, message those links to me, and I'll add them to the description for this. And yes, as Kuba says, if you are thinking, man, it's only 9:12 and you're ending the debate breakdown, I was all set to spend spend the entire evening watching this. Don't worry.
Exactly. I've got a treat for you.
Yeah, you can just switch over right now to the This Is Revolution YouTube channel, and you can continue to watch Kuba talk foreign policy stuff over there right now. So you have just a couple clicks away, and you can continue your planned evening. And this we will continue. We'll finish up next Thursday. So. Dr. Kuba, my favorite representative of the deep state. I will see you then.
Take care. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you. All right. That was Kuba Wrzesniewski. You can go over, as I said, to This Is Revolution right now. We are going to wrap up here for tonight. We'll be back, of course, on Monday night. I think I initially said Sam was going to be here on Monday. I think he's actually going to be here the following Monday. But there is a great show that's coming together. So I will just tease that there. I will see you then. Left is best.